I work for an advertising agency, I work for Ogilvy, but I anticipate of my remaining working life, the majority of my time being spent on customer experience, trust, because that only about 25% of brand value is attributable to kind of your advertising activity. The rest of it's experiential. Short-term greed undoubtedly undermines trust. It's something I think that is hugely undervalued by businesses because it generally doesn't manifest itself as a cost. It manifests itself as lost opportunities.
My name is Chris Johnson. I'm joined today by my esteemed co-host, which is Alex Genove. For those that don't know Alex, he doesn't need any introduction. He has published a fantastic book, Forget the Customer, See the Person, a business guide to deeper customer empathy and uncertain times and beyond. So Alex, welcome. Before I begin, I would love to introduce Rory. It's a real pleasure. You very kindly met with me some 7 years ago, and I know you've caught up with Alex in London as well. And I suppose for a man that needs no introduction, I'm going to introduce you anyway. You are currently the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy in London, and you were there and co-founded the behavioural science practice. And for anyone that has read your books, there's a number of them which we'll be referencing throughout the podcast, but certainly your TED Talks on YouTube are now infamous, 6 million views globally. And certainly your esteemed career has taken you all over the world. Cannes as part of the chair of the judges for the esteemed advertising awards there as well. And you've now published your Mad Masters, which we've an exclusive offer for everyone attending today. But the subject today is all about trust, Rory. So
right. This is brilliant.
What I would love to ask, and Alex is going to engage in the conversation, is really defining trust from your perspective, thinking about behavioral approaches in science in terms of how you build trust, and then thinking about how trust and lost, and then we'll look at the dark side of trust, the arts and tricks of behavioral science in terms of how we create these nudges. But let's start with trust and what's the lens that you look through in terms of consumer and employee trust?
It's something I think that is hugely undervalued by businesses because it generally doesn't manifest itself as a cost. It manifests itself as lost opportunities. And we have this problem, which is we can see the cost of a transaction. And lots of consultants and lots of accountants will come in and say, we must find ways to reduce this transaction cost. Okay. When you do that, what you don't see, that's very easy to quantify, and you lay claim to the saving and you walk away as if you've done a wonderful job. What you don't see is all the sales you fail to make because you did all the subsequent sales, the repeat purchase, the cross-selling you can do that you failed to do because you didn't actually establish proper levels of trust. Now, I suspect that Amazon does understand this because Amazon probably does measure. It has enough data and it's a fast enough business that in its approach to customer service, it probably does invest adequately because it realizes that you're only 3 angry experiences away from a lost customer or an awful lot of lost future revenue. But most people, effectively, costs are quantifiable and they're immediate, and the gains from cost saving go to the bottom line very, very quickly. Opportunity costs, which I think, mostly what you incur when you fail to establish adequate levels of trust, are very different. They're nebulous. In many cases, it takes time for them to manifest themselves. And as a consequence, I think all businesses are maybe not all, but nearly all, are vastly too heavily weighted towards maximizing short-term transactions, as distinct from investing in the long-term health of the relationship. Because investing in a relationship, as anybody who knows who's got married or anybody knows who's got a boyfriend, girlfriend, or anything else, okay, knows that it involves some upfront costs. Okay, commitment.
Sure.
I think it's also, by the way, I think there is a literal crisis online in customer service, which is in danger of being almost a systemic problem. That enough people will have had an atrocious experience of interacting with a company online where it's impossible to find the phone number, it's impossible to speak to a human being, where unless your query is one of 6 preordained types, it's impossible to get anybody to listen to you. And the risk I see there is not merely that they will abandon the companies by which they've been ill-treated, but they'll abandon the whole business of interacting online. So, you know, if you fail to invest in your long-term brand, there's a cost there in terms of your brand health relative to other brands, but it probably doesn't affect the category. All right.
Yes.
If you fail to invest in customer service, you know, we should. I mean, I was jokingly saying the other day that we need to have a campaign for the protection of call centers. You know,
Okay.
that
Yes.
we need to treat them like an endangered species
Yes.
in the world of AI.
AI. Yep. Yep.
And
Yep.
call centers are really, really important because they're the point of last resort for a problem, but also they're the only place where you become aware of where your consumers are experiencing or customers are experiencing problems, because it's likely that your online interfaces don't have a checkbox or a button for thousands of the most uncommon problems that people experience. I mean, it's interesting, even on Amazon, who I usually would cite as a good example, it's quite, well, I'll give you the classic things. How was your experience? And quite often they'll give you an opportunity to say you didn't like the product or anything else. But if the thing is marked as delivered, but you didn't receive it, okay?
Yes.
So in other words, according to their website, they delivered it to you. According to you, you can't find it anywhere, and you've walked around your garden and you've asked your neighbors, and it's still nowhere to be seen. You literally find there is no way online of actually raising that problem.
Yes.
And consequently, if you get rid of the call center as an efficiency drive, you'll never learn what's going wrong. You'll only learn what's working to plan.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And Roy, when you're thinking about, your starter point, which is trust is hard to measure, and you're almost seeing it as an intangible asset, in terms of how you're equating that to brand. And then Alex, your view about this short-termism, those 2 points in terms of the importance of measuring trust and not being inextricably linked to brand experience. And then you've just illustrated that through the example of Amazon. So in terms of the definition of trust and how you think it should be built, is it trying to quantify the measure of trust to then put that either as a risk, because you've just described it as an intangible or something that's clear? So how do we think about that measurement or defining that from that perspective?
I mean, it's probably the absolute trust would be the single best riposte to people who say what gets measured gets managed.
Yes.
Because it's in many ways a dog that doesn't bark in the night. It's something more noticeable by its absence than by its presence, I think. And if you think about it, when you interact with a trusted brand, I mean, neuroscience tends to show that when people buy trusted, familiar, famous brands, they register less mental activity than when they buy something unfamiliar. And trust is, in a way, all the things you don't have to worry about. I'll tell you a very interesting story about that, which I love to plug this company because I think they're extraordinary and weird. They don't exist in the US. They're a Dutch company originally called Quooker, and they make boiling water taps. They also make taps that dispense spring water, filtered water, chilled filtered water, and sparkling water, all from the same tap. And when I inquired, they said, if you like, we can give you a demonstration in our showroom of the tap. Now, bear in mind, they cost about £800, about $1,100, $1,000. It's a lot of money to spend on something which your kettle did beforehand. And I said, well, where's your showroom? They said, it's in Manchester. I said, to be honest, I'm not going to Manchester to have a tap demonstration. It's 200 miles away. They said, no, we'll do it online. And they spent about 20 to 30 minutes demonstrating it to me and my daughter and my wife, and we asked a few questions, and they showed us the design, and we said, well, how much does it cost to run? And they answered that question. And in the end, they said, I think they gave us a 10% discount and we ended up buying the tap. Now, what worries me about that is a lot of accountants would come in and they'd say, we need to get people to buy directly. We need to drive people towards online purchase. We can't afford that degree of investment in a sale. Now, I'm sure it's still profitable, obviously, they wouldn't do it otherwise, but they would try and drive people towards the simple interaction. I would argue that yes, there are a percentage of people, e.g., the fantastically rich, who'll just go online, order 3 of those taps for £3,000 and wait for them to arrive. I would argue that 90% of the market for that product will never buy one without a conversation with a human being first. And so our attempts to streamline transactions, which come out of neoliberal economic ideas about, effectively utility functions and so on, our attempt to streamline transactions and our tendency to see salesmanship as a cost will drive companies more and more to actually try and sell in channels that don't inspire any trust or don't generate any trust. And actually, the long-term effect of that is that you might sell very efficiently, but to far, far fewer people.
Yes.
And it becomes impossible for you to grow.
Yes. And would you say, as a result of that, Rory, it's people-centric, and maybe bring in Alex to that point, and obviously the point you made at the start about the contact center. Zappos is famous for providing excellent customer service and by the way, selling shoes as well. So we maybe ask Alex to kind of build on that point to kind of frame another question.
Just to say, the economist who understands this is Deirdre McCloskey, who's at the University of Chicago trained anyway. But she says that sweet talk is about 25 to 30% of the economy. In other words, economists tend to ignore it because they see transactions as merely an attempt to satisfy pre-existing demand. But she argues that the natural default position of humans is to do very little. It's either to do what they've done before or to do nothing or to do what everybody else does. And if you want a competitive economy, if you want coordination between human beings, if you want trade, exchange, and barter, a necessary consequence of this, if you accept that humans are human, is going to be a certain amount of investment in persuasion and reassurance.
Yes.
And the attempt to shrink that looks like an efficiency gain. It's actually shrinking the economy.
That's fascinating.
I think America's great because you're a really good salesman. I think that's why America's rich. I'm going to be blunt about this. Yes. I think if you look at, Steve Jobs, salesman, Thomas Alva Edison, salesman. They're hucksters, They're brilliant hucksters. That's why you're rich as a country. You're just really, it's that fairground snake oil stuff writ large. That's what's made you rich.
But I love the fact that you say that trust is invisible, but then that sweet talk, that 25% of the economy is invisible as well. Alex, to your point, in terms of thinking about that definition, the lens that's just been defined by Rory, what question would you then put to Rory in terms of how we would maybe expand that out?
Absolutely. Rory, again, a pleasure to chat with you again.
It's always a joy, Alex. Fantastic.
What I really love about your work, Rory, and I've been a fan for a long time, is that you bring psychology.
I'm so sorry. The phone's ringing and I'll have to stop it. I'm so sorry. We'll just pause this 1 second.
Sure.
So what's interesting, and I think there's 2 points to be made while Rory's taking a call. So the first point is this idea of business as people and people providing the bridge for trust. And that's something that, Alex, I know is really important to you and something that is ignored, thinking beyond people as numbers. But maybe if you built in that in terms of your question back to Rory there.
Right, absolutely. So what I was saying that, Rory, what I really love about your work is that you bring psychology to the business world, right? You make it accessible, you relate it to what businesses care about. And speaking of psychology, and I'm a psychologist myself, we have to think about the human brain and the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness when we developed, and commerce happened in the agora, right? So it's intrinsically social activity. So that's why I think it was a brilliant visionary decision by Tony Hsieh and the Zappos leadership 25 years ago, when they said everybody's cutting costs, to your point, for customer service to save money. We're going to go the other way. We're going to invest a lot in customer service. And so they developed this, Zappos is known for customer service now. They developed this stellar customer service that's based on no wait times, no limits to the phone call. The longest phone call was almost 11 hours long. And I personally, I mean,
I've got to know about that
I love
11-hour call.
So I mean, I know, Rory, you love anecdotes. So there's one anecdote for you. You know, the calls person, the customer center person had to take 2 bathroom breaks or so. But another story is in the early days, Tony was with friends in Vegas and having a late night dinner. And he told his friends, we have such great customer service. If you call them and order pizza, they'll arrange it for you. And they did that, and they arranged the pizza ordering. But the point is, they've developed this to be more of an expression of hospitality, which is when something happens for you, not to you. And Rory, to add to your points about cost, I would say the same applies to revenue too. The desire to accumulate more and more revenue from the customer.
Yes.
Right. At any cost, right? At the short term. So you just bought this, why don't you buy another 5 of these, right? So that's in addition.
Do you want a lovely thing to watch? I don't know if you're a fan of Jay Leno's Garage. It's a fantastic thing where he spends his fortune buying and restoring extraordinary cars, and actually benefits the whole of humanity by talking. I think it's equivalent to the Gates Foundation in terms of an act of philanthropy, okay? Because if you like cars, the pleasure millions of people derive from Jay Leno's Garage is fantastic. But he has this little film about why he never buys a Ferrari, and that's because they play the game which a lot of luxury goods brands play, which is, we'll only let you have our limited edition resellable, really valuable stuff if you buy a lot of boring stuff. And he says, with Ferrari, unless you buy a lot of kind of middle of the road, you know, abundant Ferraris, they won't let you buy any of the rarer models. And he contrasts that with McLaren. And when he rang up McLaren to order, I think, the F1, he said, and I quite like I think it's carbon fiber brakes or something. And the guy on the phone said, Mr. Leno said, are you planning to track this car, or are you basically going to drive it on the street? And he said, well, I'll take it on the track once or twice, but 90% of the time it's going to be driven just around LA. And the guy goes, well, I can save you $20,000 right off the bat because you don't want those carbon fiber brakes. He said, unless you're tracking it, they take ages to warm up to become effective. They're not very good for street use. You really don't want to pay the extra. Okay. And he said, right, I'm sold. Now, actually, one of the best ways you can establish trust is by downselling people. I talked to Alex Hormozy about this recently. Exactly. That if you actually show, I'm more interested in my reputation for selling you responsibly a worthwhile product. A colleague of mine, Kay Wheaton, similarly was downsold a washing machine where she was going to buy a Miele, and there are lots of very fancy ones, and she just had young children at the time. And they said, look, if you just had young children, your washing machine is absolutely mission critical. Buy the best brand that's most reliable, but buy the bottom of the range Miele washing machine, because it's a tank. It'll keep on going. There's nothing complicated to go wrong. The spare parts are widely available if anything does go wrong. And from that moment on, that was a sale absolutely made, but it was also trust established, because you establish your credentials by a bit of costly signaling. My willingness to invest in this relationship is proof of my commitment to you, effectively.
Exactly, Rory. And you know what this is a brilliant example of is, and I want to bring the Dalai Lama here in the conversation.
Oh, good.
Yes, HBR article on him, and he talks
that's killed our Chinese viewing figures, but never mind. Okay. Okay.
let's stay out of politics.
Exactly.
Politics,
That-
religion, and the other stuff, right?
that's a billion people not watching suddenly. Never mind. Yeah, but we will bring up the Dalai Lama. Yeah.
So no, I love this because you would expect him to say, you know, world peace and so on, but he talks about how we are all motivated by self-interest, and this is again another one of those psychological truths, right? But what he advocates for is what he calls wise self-interest, where you take the interest of the other party into account, and it's as simple as that. And I think that's what your examples represent, right? You're saying, I'm going to make a sale, I'm going to make money, but I'm going to save you some money, so I'm thinking about you as well. So any one-sidedness, for example, any greed, right, in a way, would undermine trust.
Short-term greed undoubtedly undermines trust. I mean, there's a famous anecdote. I don't know who it was, and it dates back to something like the 1970s, but America's most successful car salesman was asked what his secret was. And he said, well, when I'm selling somebody a car, my principal thought or focus is, how do I sell them their next car? Not how do I sell them this car, but how do I sell them the car after that? Now, obviously, that probably means in the short term, he was not America's most successful car salesman. What made him America's most successful car salesman was that his customers came back. I'd also say that actually metrics like hotel ratings and things are easily gamed. They're not very reliable. One really good metric for a business, which is hard to game and is, I think, pretty reliable, is repeat purchase. I spent a lot of the last 10 or 15 years evangelizing air fryers. Okay, I tried to persuade our clients at Philips to advertise air fryers at a time when they were the only company that made them, at least in the West. Okay. And my argument for doing it, I said, look, I know it's an insignificant part of your product portfolio, but what is significant is not everybody. There are people who buy air fryers and, you know, for some reason fail to see the light. But 90% of people who buy an air fryer become an air fryer evangelist. Okay. And I said, most products don't do that. If you've got a product that does that, you've got a winner. You know, you're onto a gold mine here. And so that fundamental difference between maximizing lifetime value versus maximizing short-term transactions. And of course, most of the financial incentives in a business now are driven by quarterly reports. So everybody's under pressure to do the short-term thing. Exactly. A huge amount, a very valuable thing you can do in my business, I think, is altruism. You know, it's reciprocation. Just give people things for free if they're useful and hope they'll come back. You know, it doesn't work immediately, but it works over time. And actually, the other thing that terrifies me is the dominance of what I call the tech consulting finance nexus, which effectively, okay, I'm just intrigued to know, effectively, it's driven by an efficiency mindset, not an opportunity mindset or a growth mindset. It's a Taylorist kind of efficiency model, which is inorganic. It's kind of Newtonian and reductionist and all that sort of stuff. But actually, one thing that worries me is you have this incredible stranglehold now over businesses, where if you can suggest you replace a call center with AI, okay, I don't think anybody in the board of directors would say, what are the costs of doing that as distinct from the savings?
Right.
And the tech people have managed to basically, I mean, Zappos is a complete outlier in being a company that's launched by saying, no, we're going to employ a lot of people and they're going to be really helpful to people. 99% of business proposals nowadays are, here's a way you can replace people with some machinery. Now, there are a lot of cases where we should be replacing people with machinery. You know, there's no point in having a human being tell you what your bank balance is. You can automate that. Okay, that's fine. I'm happy about that. What I worry about is this ratio is like literally 99.9 to 0.1 when it should be something like 80-20, right? It's just completely out of whack.
So do you think that this almost like rush towards, you know, automation, short-termism, and using technology as a lever is ultimately going to lead to distrust?
Yeah, definitely. No, not a shadow of doubt.
Because the three things you've said are almost like not counterintuitive, but they're kind of the secrets of the consumer behaviorism, like altruism. If you're to go into the boardroom and say, hey guys, we need to do this in a certain way, or we need to potentially downsell to get more trust or whatever, certainly to employ more people to build that longer term trust. So it seems that the building blocks for trust, there needs to be a stronger argument, would you say, in terms of how you convince, or the businesses do that have the competitive advantage? Is that what you're kind of edging towards?
I go further and say that things we're doing in business that appear to make perfect sense may be deeply damaging. Procurement, for example, strikes me as, if done well, it's a strategic discipline. It discusses things like continuity of supply, resilience. It asks really good strategic questions. Most procurement is not done well. It's basically beat people down on price, okay? And incidentally, get them to repitch for the business every 2 years so you can beat someone else down on price. Now, that violates a basic principle of reciprocation. If you're an ad agency, okay, the things you do unasked for and unpaid are quite likely more valuable to your client than the thing you're paid to do. Okay. Now, your incentive for doing that is it's an investment in the relationship. Okay. If I take them this really good idea, which our creative team has had, which they never asked for, but it could save them. We had one where we took a client an idea that actually made them an extra £10 million a year in revenue. Okay. For a cost of £25,000. Now, what you're relying on there is that they mentally put a check in the value box, and next time it comes round for renewal, they actually acknowledge that value that you've created, and you're more likely to keep the business. Okay, it's an investment in the relationship. But if every 2 years, basically procurement come in and say, we're going to repitch this whole thing, and the decision's only going to be made on price. And then you get the other weird thing with procurement, which is they're a massive obstacle to innovation, because what they want is ease of comparison. So I met a friend who's a legal, he sells legal services to the health service and to health companies. And he went in and said, I've got a solution to this. You pay us the same hourly rate as you did before, but we can achieve the same for you with 25% less hours. So we make the same hourly rate, you spend 25% less. And the procurement people said, we're not interested, because we're comparing hourly rate with hourly rate, not number of hours. So your attempt to actually enhance the value exchange by actually you make a bit more money yourself per hour, but we buy fewer hours, it's a win-win, is disallowed by the procurement function because it prevents them easily comparing apples with apples. So in advertising, for example, you might go in and they say, we've got this problem. And they say, we've got a budget of £5 million, blah, 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 blah. And you say, actually, you don't need to spend the £5 million. You can solve this problem by putting a sticker on something. Okay, sometimes those things happen, okay? And they go, we're not interested in that. We need you to quote for 2 TV commercials and 3 press ads so we can compare your cost against 3 other agencies. And you go, but we've saved you £5 million. Does that not count for anything? Nope, because it lies outside the frame of reference. It's crazy.
Exactly. So, yeah. Rory, I think what comes through for me, Chris, just to build on that, is this importance of relationships. I think, Rory, you've mentioned this so many times, and I think that's one of the biggest insights for me here, is that in a mechanistic world, right, relationships don't matter. It's like one machine operating and then another machine plug in, and that's where when you have businesses turning people into numbers, into averages, right? And I often joke when I give my talks about having 2.4 children, right, or having the average experiences and so on. But Zappos was built on relationships among employees, relationships between the vendor and the company, and so on. So that to me is one of the biggest mindset clashes nowadays. Is if you take a mechanistic view, right, relationships don't matter.
An awful lot of the value exchange is actually reciprocation of intangibles. Mm-hmm. So famously, John Kay, the professor, writes about the brilliant, and now once again brilliant actually, retailer Marks and Spencer's in the UK, which had these extraordinary relationships with suppliers, and they basically got rid of all of them and they went to low-cost suppliers in Asia for their clothing. What they'd failed to notice is because historically they've been very, very loyal to their suppliers took all their best R&D ideas to Marks and Spencer's first. And as soon as they became transactional about this, saying we pay for shirts, we don't pay for ideas, okay, the ideas stopped coming. And actually, they had exactly what you'd predict happened. It was a chap, I better not name him because I don't want to get a libel case or anything, but the CEO who took over enjoyed about 3/4 or a year of really spectacular profits. And then the reputation of the business fell off a cliff. And so an awful lot of any kind. Now, let's be honest here, because my wife used to work in procurement, and when she hears me rage about it, she gets very cross, rightly, because there are relationships which are toxic, okay? I mean, there are relationships which border on corruption, i.e. mutual back scratching, favors, golf days, and procurement does serve a really valuable function if it gets rid of some of that. And it also encourages people to innovate because, you know, an awful lot of people, let's say, buying stuff for the public sector will value a cozy repeat relationship over you know, the learning curve of starting a new one. So procurement can do really valuable things. I mean, I'm in preventing that thing becoming toxic. But at the same time, if it's absolutely rigorous and it says this is all about defined deliverables and we don't allow for intangibles at all, it's just as dangerous in the other direction.
And just then building on that, so we've defined, you know, that trust is intangible, and the people that realize the value of that intangible asset are doing these three behaviors that you just outlined. In terms of bringing that into the workplace and also for customer experience, what are the nudges or what are the lenses that we can look through, Rory, in terms of what are the strategies or tactics or approaches that would help people based on that approach to either articulate the value of trust or tactics to actually start to build that?
I mean, probably the way to sell it as a business. And, you know, I'm talking to a colleague of mine in another behavioral science practice is actually, you know, we were talking about customer service and customer experience in banks. Okay. Now, I would argue rather mischievously that most people don't change banks. They stay with banks. So if you don't provide very good customer service, you don't really lose any customers. What happens is your customers just become inert and untrusting and use you for the bare minimum of things, but you don't actually lose them as a customer, right? It's not like being a restaurant where if you provide a really bad meal, they don't come back. So banks don't notice when trust is eroded. But I would argue that high real estate prices are in part a product of low trust in banks. Okay? Which is, if you think about it, your banks, if you're a bank and you want people to invest, your competitor is actually, what's that thing in America? I need to use an American, you know, it's kind of Savills in the UK, or it's Max, whatever it is, you know, the big real estate trade.
Remax, yeah.
Remax, thank you. Yeah, because they're going to go, I don't really trust my bank. I've got so many £1,000. I'm going to put it into bricks and mortar. I'm not going to put it into actually productive investment. And I often wonder about this question, which is if we had really trustworthy, like Quaker, old-fashioned banks, okay, which were, you know, just insanely trustworthy, you know, would this have happened? Would the same property surge have happened? You know, I'm not saying it's the only factor by any means, but you know, low interest rates, cheap money, etc. But it strikes me that, you know, there is that element where low trust in a bank means that you keep the customer, you're still performing their kind of current account duties and the basic transactions. You're not actually losing a customer, but you're losing a hell of a lot of potential future business.
Right, and the same applies to insurance companies. So I don't know about the UK, but I work for State Farm Insurance here,
Yeah,
a huge insurer, and they started a bank. I mean, they insure, but they start a bank and they start life insurance, and they call them different products, and that is the idea to build trust. And the way they built trust was through this network of 16,000 agents, humans, right? That
I know. Yeah.
really that connected with you, and that I was on a on a research trip one time in rural Indiana with one of them, and I drove around with them, and we visited people's homes, and it was fascinating to observe the small town interactions and so on.
No, and of course, you know, it's in very large cities, business is a lot less social than it is everywhere else. It's much more transactional. And you notice as soon as you get out of a big city that every financial transaction also comes packaged with a social transaction. You know,
Right.
even a visit to the shops is how are you, how are your children? You know, there's an element to it which is, you know, it's deeply human.
Right.
And I think that's, and so that was State Farm. It's very interesting because they would know not to make that mistake. By the way, I think video calling is potentially in fields like medicine, in fields like financial advice. I think it's, and B2B actually, I think it's potentially a breakthrough technology, which no one's talking about because everybody's talking about AI. But historically, we had this yawning gap between what I'd call relatively low trust forms of communication. Okay, you had advertising, which was kind of trustworthy because it's expensive. Okay, if you spend a lot of money saying something, it's kind of a costly signal that you're going to deliver on your promise. Okay, you know, you wouldn't spend $30 million advertising a car if you thought it was a waste of time for people to take a test drive in it. So there's advertising and commercial communication. But then in the one-to-one level of B2B or personal financial advice, you have the telephone, the text message. Well, the telephone slightly, at least it's synchronous, okay? But you have all these little textual asynchronous modes of low trust, low engagement communication. Then you have the telephone call, which is a little bit to the right in terms of emotional connection. And then until video conferencing came along, you had this yawning gap all the way to the face-to-face meeting. And what a lot of financial advisors are telling me is they say that Zoom is a godsend because the people don't want you in their house, right? They don't want you to come around. They don't want to have to provide coffee. They don't want to have to buy biscuits. But at the same time, they're not going to invest $100,000 in something on the basis of a phone call or an email or a text. You know, it takes a conversation to, you know, to build up the net. Exactly like that cooker sale in the UK. You know, there was no way I was buying that without a 30-minute conversation. The 11-hour conversation with Zappos, I dread to think what that was about. It must have been an unbelievably convoluted problem. But nonetheless, you know, there is a, you know, trust, there are mechanisms for actually inspiring a reasonable amount of trust, and they're often quite time consuming and they involve human beings.
And Rory, to build on that, I think a very important point here is that it's not the technology that really defines the relationships and trust. And I have another quick story from my work at State Farm. Back in the day, I mean, this was many years ago, they were developing an automated voice response system for their bank, and they wanted to create one in Spanish. And so we had to, good thing we did some cross-cultural research and to find out that that segment of the population would never trust a money transaction on the phone. They would go and hand the money in person. So, right, for a variety of reasons. So it's not AI, it's just technology and the mode of interaction that matters.
Sometimes it can be technology, by the way, in that one of the things that I find, so with American Express, when I pay using online banking, you know, I've got a little bit of an American Express credit card balance. I go and send them £500. I get a text about a minute or two later saying we've received £500. And then what I do is I go and I send another £500 because I'm happy that the first £500 arrived. Okay, now it's amazing that you can often pay, let's say you pay $5,000 into a pension or an IRA or whatever. I'm not totally familiar with the American language. Okay, quite often you get no acknowledgement. Okay, so what I actually spoke to someone who worked for a pension firm who said she paid £10,000 into her pension. She heard nothing. It was her responsibility to wait 6 months for her next pension statement and check that they'd credited her account with the requisite amount of money. Now, that's just a technological failure, actually. You know, send a text, you know, send a letter if you like, it doesn't matter. But you can't have a world where people send $10,000 into the ether, okay? Because it's terrifying. You know, I had a moment when I sold some Bitcoin. Okay, I sold some Bitcoin, and because of the software design of whatever the wallet was, for about 5 minutes, the money completely disappeared. it hadn't even been putatively credited into my account. Okay, so I was there just going, "Oh my God!" Okay,
Meltdown.
absolute agony.
Yeah.
And so Bitcoin actually is probably, if there's one area where people should research. I'm so sorry, I'll just delete this. Bitcoin is one area where actually they need to research trust, because that's probably the single biggest obstacle to these currencies actually becoming widespread.
Right.
They're too techy for their own good.
Yes, and just linking to that, how much is it about signaling and priming in terms of establishing that trust? Using the example of banks, you have the visual pillars, but now you have these neobanks that are providing these really slick experiences. So how much is it about signaling and priming for the trust, in terms of video conferencing, if we were to go back to that? Love to build on that point, tips for people building experiences in the role of messaging and communication and signaling.
I mean, one thing is disguise your greed. Okay, there's one thing that I'll tell you two very interesting things. There's a guy I was speaking to, I think it was at Price Waterhouse or possibly at Deloitte.
Yes.
And he said that working for many, many years on businesses, he said, you can divide businesses from customer-focused, trust-focused, relationship-focused businesses, and effectively slightly, how would you describe it? Almost sociopathic businesses, greedy businesses. So one very simple heuristic, he said, are the call center staff allowed to call out?
Ah.
And he said that more or less divides the sheep from the goats, as it were. And the reason is that now I think psychologically we react very, very differently. Amazon has call me back. Okay, no other company has copied that, fascinatingly, but it has that button where it says my goods didn't arrive, call me. And 30 seconds later your phone rings and someone who already knows about your problem basically deals with it. And I think there's something really interesting there, which is the mentality is manifest in, no, the call center is a cost. We don't want them calling out. We want to minimize call duration, versus we want to maximize problem solving. And often that means calling the person back. But I think the psychological effect of having a company call you, which makes you feel like a valued customer, is massively different to being made to wait on hold, which makes you feel like a supplicant. Even if the conversation in the subsequent call is exactly the same, the direction of travel of the call, I think, is massively decisive. So that we just, one example of kind of companies that have this kind of, effectively, they're basically trying to minimize the cost of your transaction and they don't care about the relationship. And they're companies that are trying to maximize the value exchange and they're prepared to forego a little bit of short-term profit in the service of a greater end.
And this, to me, Rory, is a perfect example of this definition of hospitality, when something happens for you, not to you.
Yeah.
Right? When you call, it happens to you, right? But just to bring the Zappos customer service into the conversation again. It's famous for many things, right? But in our research, when we dove deeper, we found, first of all, the call center agents are measured on creating an emotional connection with the customer, more than satisfying solving the problem. The problem has to be solved, but this emotional connection has to be created. But what we found was there's two ingredients in the success and of this famous customer service. Very simple. One is when you say, I'm sorry that this happened to you. I'm sorry, and you take full responsibility. You don't blame UPS. You don't blame anybody else, the neighbors. I'm sorry you didn't get it. And then secondly, I'm going to fix it for you. These two things. When people hear these two things, they calm down. So the point is, and my point about technology is that even with notifications, Rory, I think in some cases technology fails, of course, or works, but in some cases a human decided not to build in the notification. It was a human decision.
Yes, it was.
Just like if we were conversing and I ask you, Rory, did you receive my money? And you're quiet and you're on your phone, you look down, and it's like, and you're like, what's happened? It's the same.
It's the same. You're right. It's the technological manifestation of a human failing. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Failing of empathy, really, isn't it? And by the way, that business of kind of the goods didn't deliver, I mean, this literally happens where you go, your goods did not arrive. and they go, you need to contact UPS or, you know, or whoever it might be. Okay. You go, but you didn't even let me choose UPS. I mean, UPS are actually very good here. I don't know what they're like in the US, but here in the UK, they're fantastically good. So I'm unfairly vilifying them. But it would be one of several other couriers which would cause the problem, probably not UPS. But I go, you didn't even let me choose them, okay? You mandated them because it probably maximizes your volume rebates for sending as many packages as possible through. I paid for the delivery, you chose the courier, and now when I have a problem, it's my problem. I've got to contact the courier. And you get literally cases where this plausible deniability of we've solved our part of the problem, so the customer's problem is the customer. A classic case of that is parking apps, okay, where you have a parking app and it's an underground car park and there's absolutely no mobile signal. Right? Okay, now, that's an absolute case where effectively it's nobody's problem except the consumers. Because each of the other three parties involved, the operator of the car park, who's a retailer, the person who provides the parking app and possibly makes money from the fines, incidentally, okay, that's a really extraordinarily common thing. For companies like pubs in the UK to give away their car park to an independent parking operator, which largely makes money from fining their own customers, okay, that to me is just an absolute manifestation of where capitalism's gone completely wrong. And so what it is, you know, there you have the mobile phone operator, the mobile phone network, you have the car park operator, you have the business that the car park serves. And what they've done is they've done things which are mutually financially beneficial to all three of them. Lots of fine revenue from my car park, you know, no mobile signal, okay? And nobody then stands to be blamed because you can always shift the blame onto someone else. And those are kind of Kafkaesque nightmare situations which technology is creating. You have three parties involved in providing a service. None of the three will take responsibility.
Right,
and the customer loses, right? It's like you're going
just for the record, I mean, UPS is a fantastic company. Fantastic.
I agree. I totally agree with you. Yeah, yeah.
And
I actually am a private customer of UPS.
Oh yeah,
so,
no,
yeah.
and I just gave it because they're one of the dominant companies. So basically, it's saying don't blame another party, don't blame the delivery party, or absolutely, I totally agree.
And that's interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry. Funnily enough, you occasionally get cases where companies are prevented from saying I'm sorry by the legal function, who will say under no circumstances must you admit responsibility. And I spoke to a lawyer who said there are cases where massive court cases for medical malpractice have ensued when all the aggrieved party wanted was the words I'm sorry, an acknowledgement that we made a mistake.
Yes, and I think just maybe to steal one of your visuals from one of your famous talks, just to kind of bring this into focus. So I think this is a really good summary where
I must credit the creator of this. This is he's called David Rock, I think. He's a New Zealander based in New York. He's a neuroscientist, and it's called the SCARF model. And SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, which you might call, I'd almost call it reciprocation and fairness. And those are things which we feel viscerally, you know, all of those things: lack of certainty, lack of autonomy, powerlessness, lack of adequate reciprocation, you know, fairness. All of those things we react to emotionally. They're part of our evolved psychology, and yet we don't have units of measurement for them.
And that, I think, do you think this is a good way to think about how you can build trust, you know, elevate status to the customer, you know, create the certainty that you just talked about in terms of notifications, autonomy in terms of that independence to complete tasks and complete goals? Is this a good lens, Rory, or, you know, is this one to build on from your perspective?
I often use this as a checklist, which is how might we be violating one of these five things. An example of fairness is interesting because in standard economic theory, if you paid more for something than somebody else did, all other things being equal, okay, An economist wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that, but the customer would. And there are lots of other things go on in human psychology which aren't accounted for in economics. And economics is a dishonest attempt, I think, to reduce psychology to the level of a physical science, which I think, given the degree of complexity involved in human perception, is it's actually profoundly dishonest intellectually. And it shouldn't be allowed. I agree with Nassim Taleb when he said economics should not exist.
Love that. I love that. And then just on that point, you said it's really hard to measure. So this is a checklist. So how should we think? And just going to the questions in the comments on LinkedIn Live, people are saying, well, how do you then think about the measurement of trust?
Well, Alex has an advantage living in the United States, where I love the fact that the weather forecasts have two temperatures, the objective temperature and the feels like temperature. And that strikes me as a really useful distinction, because I'm a sort of fat Welsh guy of Celtic heritage who's not great. You'll know this as an Irishman, okay, right? You're
Yeah.
not great in hot weather. Fair?
Yes, that's
okay,
it.
right. You know, I always noticed this. I had a
Yeah.
colleague called John O'Shea who
Yeah.
hated going to the Cannes Advertising Festival because it was too hot. All he did was wander around and people say, have you seen any of the great work? And he goes, no, it's too hot. Okay.
Yes.
But weirdly, I can wander around Phoenix, Arizona when it's 100 degrees pretty happily. But if it hits 90 degrees in London or 85, I don't go into work. Okay,
Yes.
right. And the feels like temperature is a really useful distinction, because it involves not only temperature, which is an objective measure, it involves humidity, I think, breeze, if there's some sort of breeze, and also it's something to do with air temperature 5 feet from the ground, which isn't the same as the meteorological measure of temperature. And actually, so often, I think what economics is doing is it's optimizing the temperature, not the feels like temperature. In other words, it's saying we must reduce the temperature of this, I reduce the price to make it more desirable. What you actually need to do is reduce the humidity or introduce a bit of a breeze
Yes.
to achieve the same effect.
I love that. I love that analogy, because it introduces this idea of dimensions to experience and management, right? You know, we want to ask the closed question, do you trust this, yes or no?
Yeah.
Whereas I think, you know, the narrative is coming from the consumer, and trying to quantify that from an emotional activation perspective is really interesting. So, and I think, Alex, you have an important point to make there in terms of the question of how you frame the measurement of trust. I think you've talked about, do you have my best interests in mind, and asking that to the consumer to then elicit a story about either the elevation of that or where that hasn't been true. So I'm wondering, is that a nice way to build on that dimensional piece that came from Rory in terms of how we start to quantify and measure trust?
Absolutely, Chris. So to Rory's point about the mechanical, physical qualities and psychology, some things are what's interesting about psychology is some things are not observable or easily. We don't have a trust thermometer, right? So the only way to get into people's heads is to, I mean, you can observe behavior that's signals to trust and so on. There's some psychophysiological measures that have been attempted, but I think the most straightforward way is to just ask people. And this is a question that I heard Fred Reichheld talk about years ago. I mean, he created this trust question. He didn't market it properly, I guess, but I think it's brilliant. It says retailers or a business always has my best interest as a customer in mind, and that goes towards the Dalai Lama's definition too. So it's a bit of an extreme, like always has my best interest as a customer in mind. To me, when somebody rates that, right? Then you get a sense of how they feel about the relationship, essentially.
Yeah, so I mean, for example, retailers now, which are driving everybody to use self-checkout, this is what I call the dangerous techno-creep, okay, which is it's what you might call Sutherland's law of where things go wrong, which is technologies are introduced like self-checkout tills or ticket machines at stations. And in their early days, they're an option. So they're welcome to practically everybody, because sometimes I know exactly what ticket I want to buy. I don't need to queue. I don't need a conversation. It's an entirely perfunctory exchange where I value efficiency over relations. And then what happens is the accountants notice that it's cheaper to sell a ticket through a ticket machine than it is through a ticket barrier, a ticket office that's manned by a human being. So they start having more and more machines and cutting back on the humans with the aim of getting rid of the humans altogether. And that's where technology has gone from being a valuable option and an extra string to your bow as a customer. Oh, it's nice that I can check my gas bill online. That's handy. And that's how, in the early days of the internet, I encountered most technologies. Parking apps were an alternative to paying with cash. And then what happens is the finance people come in and they go, McDonald's has started opening in the UK. I find this almost unbelievable. 120 restaurants they're planning to open, according to the Stoke Sentinel, which may not be the most reliable, but anyway, but which have no conventional till. In other words, you have to order on screen. And their argument is, well, 50% of our customers already order on screen. Yeah, but 50% of them don't.
Yeah.
And so what you find is that the technology arrives as this wonderful welcome thing, as an extra alternative for the consumer, and then it ends up as an imposition. And I can see that happening time and time again. And it kind of frightens me, because the power of finance in an organization is a hell of a lot greater than the power of marketing. Okay, the marketers who are actually pushing against this and saying, no, the purpose of marketing is not to sell as cheaply as you can, it's to sell to as many people as you can profitably over time. And that may even mean making a loss occasionally. Undoubtedly, you may have to lose money solving a consumer problem. So you have to write off that transaction and say the relationship is more valuable than the transaction. But finance people look at averages, they look at a snapshot. One of the things people don't realize, okay, is that many bad consumer experiences, and you go, well, the package didn't arrive, oh dear, bit of a failure. They went to the website and they couldn't find an answer. They went to the call center and they had to wait for 20 minutes, okay? Then they couldn't get through, then the person couldn't solve their problem, okay? Now, the way the business looks at that is, oh, we're being slightly suboptimal. We're failing on 3% of these transactions at the level of delivery. We're failing at 3% of these transactions at the level of call waiting time. Now, to the consumer, that's 4 shit experiences in a row. Okay. All right. It's not 4 isolated incidents. It's 4 bad experiences in a row. And that's what induces rage. It really induces rage, and all manner of problems arise from that.
Yes. I think just adding to that and sticking with the whole dimension piece, I think if we're to think about the forming of emotion, often we think about it as a static, predeformed state, whereas, Plutchik's-Wheel would say, it actually moves from in the trust acceptance to trust the admiration, where it's more of an outward display of that. So going back to the question on LinkedIn, I think about using the voice of the customer employee to quantify the activation on emotion to understand exactly where the customer employee is. I am now going to quote Sutherland's rules of trust, by the way, so I hope you're not going to be embarrassed by that, because I think what you've done is really think about how do you build trust, and think about the wisdom from yourself, Rory, in terms of the science behind building trust and articulating trust. And what you've actually articulated is that taking a longer term view and balancing cost and the appropriate tactic, technology, or whatever, is a more rounded view of how businesses should think about trust.
So I'm going to hand over to Alex here a bit, because I think that Zappos and Amazon were a very good fit. I hope so, anyway. And the reason I think what they both share is that, from talking to people who work for Amazon, they do the same thing as every other company does, but they do it in reverse order. And what Amazon does is they ask a question about a hypothetical innovation, and they say, okay, they don't start with the data and say, what data do we have? How can we make more money? Okay. They start with, has anybody got an idea that would benefit the customer? Okay. Do we then have any data to support this theory, or do we need to actually acquire different data in support of the theory? In other words, don't start with the data you have. This is a criminal investigation. There's things you know and things you need to know. Okay. And the third thing is, if we think this will add value to the customer, we better work out a way to make it pay or to justify it. Most other companies do that process completely in reverse, which is how can we save some money? Okay, right, let's cut this thing. What's the effect on the customer? Well, don't worry about that too much. Amazon starts with the customer benefit, it starts with value, and then works its way through to cost. Okay, most companies start with cost. It's fundamentally a question of whether you talk in terms of cost or whether you talk in profit, and whether you talk in terms of value. Because if you define yourself around customer value, you're going to come up with very different ideas and a very different experience. And I imagine Zappos did it the same way, because nothing else explains them. Actually, your very DNA was value, trust, service focused.
Exactly, Rory. I mean, that's you're absolutely correct. This is a lot of those companies won by unconventional, counterintuitive decisions, and that's the conundrum about data, because everybody's now talking about data. All these decisions that were brilliant and that made these companies winners were not necessarily based on data.
They weren't. No, I mean, actually, because the really big idea, let's not forget, you probably have the same data as most of your competitors. So if there were a really good idea that the data revealed, someone's probably already done it. But also, as you made the point earlier, we don't have numerical values. Fred Reichelt was undoubtedly an attempt to provide them.
Right.
We don't have numerical values that measure customer emotions to the same degree that we have beautiful metrics about customer transactions. Then, if you look at data, most of it's collected for aggregation upwards for financial reporting purposes. And the act of aggregation, the act of averaging, destroys the value of the data, because the real importance is in the outliers and the anomalies. It's not in the average. In fact, you don't have many average customers. If you look across more than 3 or 4 or 5 dimensions, the number of customers you have who are kind of average on all 5 is weirdly small. And so this is the great crime of economics, the single representative agent. The assumption that if you optimize for the single representative agent, who is an average of all your customers, then you're optimizing for the whole.
Right. And what's interesting, Rory, is that now with speaking of technology and the power of technology, with AI and with natural language processing, you can quantify emotion that's hidden in text, right? And that's what Chris's company does, right? I mean, in our research, we've correlated sentiment hidden in hundreds of thousands of customer comments. So AI maps positive versus negative sentiment. You can extract net sentiment, and that correlates highly significantly and very strongly with site visits and purchases. I mean, then you can start proving your points with quantitative data.
And in the case of a bank, of course, the whole business value of a bank depends really on its ability to cross-sell and upsell consumers over time.
Right.
Okay. Now, if you're eroding the very thing that makes that possible in order to, meet some short-term quarterly objective, okay, that's not good business. That's insanity. And and that's very interesting. So you and Amazon, if I'm right, neither of you really judges call center operatives. Octopus Energy is the same in the UK. They don't judge call center operatives on number of calls handled or anything perfunctory like that. It's entirely about the emotional consequences of the call. Is that it?
I mean, I can speak for Zappos, right?
Yeah.
The Amazon model is a little bit different because they're massive and their scale necessitates slightly different. Right, they help you with automation and you can get your problem resolved through chat. And different people value different modes of communication.
I like live chat, actually. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the weird things about live chat is that it tends to have very high levels of consumer happiness. What's weird about it is objectively, live chat takes 3 times as long as a phone call. But for some weird reason, because while they're waiting, people can get on with other stuff. You can watch television, you can feed your dog. Actually, people don't mind the end-to-end time.
Exactly, that's it.
So it's a little bit of magic, actually, in live chat. Yeah.
Because it's asynchronous, asynchronous. And speaking of just a very quick insight that we had from years ago, we had a panel with some young people, Gen Zers at the time, I guess. and we talked about their preferences for speaking on the phone versus texting. And what they said, I prefer texting, but it was interesting why you prefer texting, because I'm sitting next to a friend that I don't want to hear them to hear what I'm saying.
Of course.
Right, one,
Yeah,
or I don't have to respond right away, or so
exactly. Yeah.
all these reasons. So you need to dive into the reasons why people prefer a phone call, why they prefer text, why they prefer email.
Fantastic.
Superb. And I think that's a rounded point to kind of conclude our discussions. I think.
Well, tell us a bit about what you do. What's your specialism? Is this the analysis effectively of?
Yeah, so I suppose, Rory, you know, your sage advice about, you know, when we met 7 years ago about whether I should pursue a award as a tech scaling company and the value of emotion. We have gone ahead and built an ability to quantify human trust. We do that for Amazon, you know, Zoom, Allstate, P&D, and essentially what we're doing is quantifying human emotion from unstructured text, and then we're using that to attach to topics and drivers, and ultimately then predicting if you're to remove that and lessen the emotion, what impact does that have on the bottom line. So I think with trust and with emotion, there's this difficulty and gap between connecting that there to business value. And I think that's where, you know, where we've learned essentially from these organizations trying to achieve that.
I think marketers shouldn't have surrendered this argument that because lots of tech people gave it and said everything we do can be quantifiable. We'll have so much data that the data will tell you exactly what to do with every dollar of marketing spend. And we went, yes, oh, we like that vision. Oh, yes, let's acquiesce in your argument. What we should have done is said that's bollocks and it's impossible, because 50 to 60% of what you do in marketing that has value is impossible to quantify or attribute. Okay, you can't quantify the overall value accurately, and attributing something like fame. Okay, fame is unbelievably valuable as an attribute. Okay, but it's impossible to actually, you don't have the counterfactual of how big would this company be if no one had ever heard of it. Okay, so valuing fame is basically impossible. And then attributing your fame to any one incident. I mean, there are a few cases where you can do that. I think Superdry was basically selling from a market stall, and then David Beckham happened to wear one of their shirts. Okay, so you do occasionally have one incident that makes you famous. You know, Monica Lewinsky, we could probably say, you know, okay, right, okay. But for the most part, your fame is something that's aggregated over time through a whole mixture of different facets and behaviors.
And what you're doing in terms of elevating, what you're saying is that marketing should be elevated in terms of having that contributing factor to business impact is really important. It's something that you're supporting through your Mad Masters, and I'm wondering if you could maybe just give us a quick line on that, because we're offering a 10% discount to anyone who signs up. That's going to 400 people today, Rory. So we'd love to just tease out a one-liner on that.
It's a course, a mixture of recorded content and live online surgeries every 2 weeks, with additional follow-up and advice if you feel the urge. So it is genuinely a mix of live and recorded content, which you can either perform in sequence or you can actually do at leisure. And definitely go to Mad Masters if you've liked what you've heard. And I think what I'd love to do is actually interview Alex more. We're producing additional modules all the time, and actually a door board as well, because these are really important questions. And I think marketing is very good at creating value. It's a hell of a lot better at creating value than it is at winning arguments.
Yes.
And we've got to be justifiably paranoid over. I mean, I work for an advertising agency, I work for Ogilvy, but I anticipate of my remaining working life the majority of my time being spent on customer experience, trust, you know,
there you go.
because that only about 25% of brand value is attributable to kind of your advertising activity. The rest of it's experiential.
But do you not think the marketeers are missing a trick? Because it's a bit like the rise of social media, and you know, it's like who owns the social media conversation? Well, it seems the customer experience should or could be owned by marketing, because the biggest lever in experience is communication. And I think that is a natural house for marketeers.
You know that joke that goes, where chaps offer the choice between going to heaven and going to hell, and when he's shown
Yes.
hell, it's a lot of people sitting around drinking tea and listening to nice music, and he goes, look, whereas heaven is full of lots of religious devotion and a hell of a lot of church attendance. And he
Yes.
goes, well, based on the two, I'll actually, and so he chooses hell, and the next day he's basically knee deep in brimstone with sulfurous fumes, being
Yeah.
taunted by devils. And he goes, what the hell happened? He said, well, yesterday you're a prospect, today you're a customer. Okay, right. And you actually, as a consumer, you actually see yourself crossing this magic toll booth,
Yes.
where at the point, up to the point of purchase and the acknowledgement email saying thank you for your order, everything's absolutely fine and dandy. And then the second anything goes wrong, anything unusual happens, you've crossed into that weird world of sort of, a whole world of pain.
Yes.
And the contrast between the two actually is almost worse, because you've overpromised and underdelivered, which makes the ultimate conception of the thing even worse, I think.
So
there's an airline here which is brilliant if you're buying a ticket, but if you want to check it online, it's going to be an absolute disaster. And that's the kind of thing that happens all the time.
Fantastic. And look, I think that's a nice rounded point to make to conclude our discussion. Roy, it always feels that we're having a pint when we have a chat. It's a very conversational, as if I'm sitting in your beautiful Abbey building in Wales there. So
no, not in Wales, I'm in Kent, but I come from Wales, but I'm actually living just outside London. Yeah.
Yes.
Both of you,
Fantastic.
next time you're in London, come on by. I'd love to go out to dinner and learn a lot more.
Thank you so much. Rory, you're an absolute superstar. The legend that is Rory Sutherland. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure. Fantastic.
Take care. Thanks
Alex,
again.
see you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.